all the Saw scores sort of use 2 or 3 of these little 3 and 4 note motifs that even if I'm playing some sound that is some abstract bowed metal soundscape thing, I will still use the correct melodic and chord progressions that relate to the other more musical and more melodic scenes that might have a piano or a harp playing that musical part. And to me, that's just a natural way to go, but that helps to give the entire score across the 30 or 50 cues in one of these movies to have some kind of consistency, and they relate to each other, even if it's not apparent on the surface. And another thing I like to do, because the Saw movies, and this isn't something that applies to every project that I've scored by any means, but especially for the Saw movies, usually the story is of people being dragged down into some terrible fate. And so, for instance, I will only use downward motion in the chord progressions and the modulations. There's never anything rising, except in a couple of key moments when we really want to have a strong contrast and have the music kind of poke itself up out of the dark background. I'm Charlie Clouser, and I compose scores for films such as the Saw horror movie franchise, and sometimes I make records. The Saw film franchise is a little different from a lot of horror movie franchises that have a very thematic kind of approach. Especially on the first one, I really wanted it to feel like the sound was kind of dissolving and getting more and more indistinct as the movie went on. So in the beginning, the sounds and the melodies are sort of legible, and then it just gets more and more clouded and confusing sounding until finally, by the sort of midway through the third act, the score is just dissolved into basically banging on pots and pans and scraping metal sounds, because we knew there was going to be this spot towards the end of the movie where there's the big twist ending reveal. And at that point, the score was going to radically switch gears and become bright and strident and bold and very thematic and melodic. So we kind of had this roadmap already in place that we knew we kind of had to fit things into this big descending triangle and then this big spike at the end. And that kind of, having that roadmap has been really helpful, because then it's sort of like having a coloring book where the outline is already there, and now you just have to decide what color the clown's shoes are going to be, you know. All the movies have had a similar kind of layout where we develop a roadmap and an arc of what the score needs to do kind of before writing any of the music. And then it becomes just a task of filling in that outline that we've established at the beginning. And in terms of what the content, I mean, that defines the form of the thing. And in terms of what the content needs to be, I'm really grateful that I found an opportunity like the Saw franchise where I can use the sort of sounds that I'm interested in. Even though my background when I was making records was in there was a lot of synthesizer use, on the Saw scores there really is almost no synthesizers at all. It's mostly heavily processed acoustic sounds and some orchestral sounds just to add a bit of width and depth to the thing. But the vast majority of the sounds are things that I've created on some weird instruments, whether it's these weird bowed metal instruments that I have, or even heavily processed guitars, and just trying to make sounds that are dark, heavy, and terrifying. One of the most important aspects of doing a film or television score for me is creating a unique set of sounds that I'm going to use as the raw material for the compositions. And I didn't come from a background in orchestration and arranging. I came from a background in programming synths and sound design and processing sounds. And even if I wasn't composing for film, I'd still be always looking for sounds that I've never heard before. And fortunately, in the type of films that I do score, that's a receptive environment for unusual and unheard of sounds that may be really evocative of an emotion or a situation, even when you're just playing one or two notes, because the character of the sound is so evocative and so rich and full of background that the listener can conjure up a whole storyline in their mind just from one sound. So that's why I've always been attracted to using unusual acoustic instruments and recording and processing them heavily, and also to manipulating stuff inside the computer, time stretching things by ungodly amounts to create crazy artifacts, and to turn one little molecule of sound into a whole long evolving soundscape. I've just completed the score for the 10th movie in the Saw horror movie franchise. So that's 20 years, 10 movies. And this latest one is a little different from many of them because sort of the first third of it takes place outdoors and in daylight, and people aren't suffering and in pain. And we go through the story of our protagonist, John Kramer, maybe finding a cure for the brain cancer that's going to kill him any minute. And so there's layers of inquisitive cues, and then hopeful cues, and sort of uplifting solo cello melodies and things that are out of character for, you'd think, for a Saw movie. Then, of course, it all goes horribly wrong, and we descend into the depths of the dungeons, and then we break out some of the more familiar textures from the Saw scores. And then there are the inevitable trap scenes where our hopeless victims are strapped into some machine that is going to do very bad things to them. And even those cues are even more extreme and bonkers than they've ever been in the past movies. And I've been able to use some of the new recent acquisitions like the apprehension engine to use the hurdy-gurdy element on there to sort of evoke the feeling of sawing away at one of your limbs, because the sound of that hurdy-gurdy cranking around kind of sounds like somebody sawing. And so there's this sort of bright and sunny and hopeful mode at the beginning, and then an even more intense and out of control mode as the violence and the torture begins. Then, of course, it ends with a twist. It wouldn't be a Saw movie without a twist ending. And so towards the end, things start getting very thematic and almost like orchestral, and we know that we're lurching toward an inevitable conclusion, but that final conclusion is yet another twist. So it sort of has these three phases that I had to color in. And especially for that first phase where things are hopeful and there might be a ray of sunshine coming into the Saw universe, that's where I was able to use a lot of the Soundiron libraries that I've accumulated over the years, especially some of the solo vocalist libraries, where the director specifically requested that we have just a touch of a mournful, distant female singer just singing a gentle little 3-note melody just when a particular character appears. Just wanted just a sniff of not even happiness, but of humanity. And in amongst all these dark and metallic sounds, there would be this, a gentle female vocal just singing, ah, and that would be such a color change from all the rest of the sonic landscape that it would immediately stand out and signify that it was linked to this character as they appeared on screen. And of course, the director said, so, do you know any singers you can hire? And I said, I have them right here on my hard drive. And he was suspicious at first. He was skeptical. He thought, that you can't use samples. That can't possibly work. And I pulled up, I think it was the Voices of Wind a day, and I just played 3 notes on it, and the director was literally, his jaw dropped. He said, you're playing that on the keyboard? You can make that girl sing whatever you want, basically? And I said, I know it's hard to believe, but that's exactly what we're doing here. And so that became the signifier of this one particular character in the movie, was some of the solo vocal libraries from the Voices of Wind and the Voices of Gaia series from Soundiron, and it saved my butt on this score. So here I have a cue from Saw X that is early in the movie, and it's a sort of very out of character for Saw movies. It's very gentle and quiet, and it's the first time we meet a sympathetic character, or a character that we want the audience to be sympathetic towards. She's this young Mexican girl who's had her life saved by this experimental cancer treatment. It needed to be very sort of low-key and a little bit dreamy, and have a particular moment of when the door opens and we first see her. The director requested that we have just some kind of vocal texture that was very feminine and gentle, not something you'd typically find in a Saw movie. So what I did was, and this was not planned, this was me searching through terabytes of my sample libraries, trying to find sounds that had the right gentle and evocative and slightly emotional character. And what I wound up with, and I swear this is not like a put-up job for a Soundiron promo, this is just what I wound up with, was one sound from one of the Soundiron libraries called Iron Pack 4, and a sound called Iridium, I believe. And that creates just a very gentle, not quite a drone, but a very quiet tone that served as the backdrop, and it sounded like this. This is just that sound by itself. Just a distant voice kind of texture, or maybe almost a whistling wind sort of tone. And that created the backdrop. It gently plays the chords. And around that, I then added another similar texture, also purely coincidentally that it's another Soundiron product. This was from the Voices of Gaia Bryn, and this was one of the sounds that is in the sort of sound design folder, and that was a similar kind of texture, playing a little bit less drony, and that one sounded like this. Just kind of easing us into the moment when the solo vocal would occur. And for that, this was what I was able to amaze the director when he thought, okay, we're gonna have to hire a singer. We're gonna need to bring a vocalist in to just do this one little tiny part, just literally 3 or 4 notes. And I said, I think I can do that using my sample libraries. And so I wound up using yet another Soundiron product, Voice of Wind Ade. And I have tons of similar libraries, solo female vocalists that have a legato sample set so that you can play a very realistic legato singing part. And of course, the director was amazed. He said, "Are you kidding me? You can just play on the keyboard the notes that you want the singer to sing?" I said, "Yep, I know it sounds like the future, dude, but it absolutely worked." And here's the part that I wound up with using the Voice of Wind Ade. It's a very simple, gentle, and evocative part. And all of that stuff together formed the whole entree into this cue. It starts off with those sound designy vocal textures. It suggests the melody that's about to come. Another piece of Soundiron from Voice of Gaia, Francesca. is that sort of swell, very warm, comforting chord. And then the voice of wind, Ade, comes in and plays the little melody. Then other instruments and other recordings from my collection come in and sort of fill out the musical side of things. A little bit of piano. Another little piece of Ade. And you know, the sound design elements in many of these Soundiron libraries that are sort of, they're not just a straight ahead person singing into a microphone like the Ade soloist is. They have the texture of a vocalist, but they're a little bit removed from reality. There's a little bit of a sort of haze around them. They don't sound like a synthesizer, but they also don't just sound like a woman singing directly into a microphone. There's this ethereal cloud surrounding the sound in that Iron Pack Iridium and in the voices of Gaia Bryn and Francesca. And those were what helped to create a backdrop for that little bit of solo vocal that comes in, so that it's not sort of a bunch of strings and then a singer comes barreling in over the top. You're already comfortable in floating in this sort of cloud of voice-like textures before that little solo melody comes in. And the director loved it. He said, great, sold, use it. And that's what's in the movie. And here's another cue from Saw X where I used, I didn't use the gentle voices of wind, but I did use both some ambiences and some percussion hits from the Rust collection, which has been a huge favorite of mine, because those giant metal hits in the Rust collection just, to me, sound like they belong in a Saw movie. They sound like we're underground in some bunker or some dungeon and some giant door is clanking shut. And so I use some of the percussion strikes from, I forget which volume of Rust it is, but it was an instrument called rail strikes. That I guess is striking on a metal railing inside some underground missile silo or something. And this cue is one of the trap scenes in Saw X. So it's a very violent and complex scene with a very elaborate tempo map, and drums start and stop, and machines are starting and stopping. And then once things get going, then I needed this sort of big chunky guitars that with little breaks of percussion in between. And so I used the rail strikes from one of the Rust libraries, and by themselves, they sound like this. I've put a sort of auto panning effect on as a plug-in to get things swinging around in the stereo field. And at first you might think, okay, that's not, it's just some light percussion hits. But in context, with all the other junk that's flying around, those really jump out of the speakers. And the fact that I made them swing around in the stereo field really helps to make them poke out. So once everything is firing on all cylinders, it sounds like this. And so just having those really characterful, reverberant sounds with the reverb kind of baked into it just made it so much easier to create those little percussion accents that are going to stand out in the mix. And then they come back a little while later and wind up sounding like this. And it just adds a little bit of extra chaos and mayhem in the midst of all this stuff that's flying around. Of course, in the actual movie, there's a lot of other sound design of metallic sounds and so forth, but I was careful to put these sounds in a section where there's not also some similar kind of clanking sound design going on accompanying the picture. Earlier on in this cue, towards the beginning, I used some other sounds from one of the Rust libraries that I believe was called Tower Ambiances. And I'm not sure where this exactly came from, which collection, but I think it was from one of the Rust collections that had some a sort of a sound design folder where they're heavily processed ambient dronescape type of sounds. And by themselves, these tower ambiances sound like this. Just a haunting, metallic, almost a breathing kind of effect. And so I used those to kind of create a backdrop for the musical sound design that occurs at the very beginning of the cue, which sounds like this. And it really helped to create that kind of haunting, claustrophobic, and dark soundscape that sets us up for the mayhem that's about to occur. And so, you know, the Rust series has been a huge part of my template, and I always keep those sounds on deck and ready to go because they really do conjure up the kind of atmosphere of a Saw movie really well.